You made a fatal mistake, Officer Sullivan, and now the whole world will see who you really are. What makes a decorated police officer's confident lies crumble into desperate confession in front of a packed courtroom? An experienced cop accuses a black man of drunk driving, assault and resisting arrest during a routine traffic stop. Her testimony seems rock solid until he takes the stand and systematically destroys every fabrication with the calm precision of someone who has been trained to do exactly that. Who is he, and why does his composed analysis make the officer visibly sweat while the district attorney realizes the case is collapsing in real time? Because Officer Rebecca Sullivan thought she was facing just another black man who could be bullied into submission by the weight of her badge and the system behind it. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. This is the story of how one calculated lie collided with someone carrying credentials that turned her predatory tactics into career suicide, and how a fight for justice became a masterclass in exposing corruption. Let's dive into it. If you believe that no one should ever face false arrest and manufactured charges by corrupt law enforcement, type .truth below. Then comment your country and city. Let's see where people stand against police corruption worldwide. Your participation shows that accountability knows no borders. The early morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Cook County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The building, with its imposing columns and vaulted ceilings, had witnessed countless trials over the decades, moments where justice either prevailed or failed. Today it would host a case that would be remembered long after the final verdict was rendered. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Wooden benches filled with a diverse crowd, curious locals, journalists with recording devices ready, and a group of police officers in pressed uniforms occupying the back rows like a silent wall of blue solidarity. The air felt heavy with expectation, the kind that precedes moments when truth and deception collide with devastating force. At the defense table sat Marcus Thompson, his presence both commanding and unusually calm. At 42, he possessed the kind of controlled strength that made people take notice without fully understanding why. His dark brown skin contrasted sharply with his crisp charcoal suit, and his close-cropped hair was beginning to show distinguished threads of grey at the temples. He wore a burgundy tie, a colour chosen deliberately to project both confidence and humility. But it was his eyes that truly distinguished him. Dark, penetrating, and impossibly steady, they moved across the room with systematic precision that suggested he was cataloguing every detail, every face, every subtle shift in body language. To the casual observer, he appeared to be just another defendant, perhaps anxious about his fate. But those paying closer attention might have noticed something unusual. The way he sat with perfect posture, the controlled breathing pattern, the hands that remained perfectly still despite the gravity of his situation. Beside him, Benjamin Foster shuffled through legal documents with barely concealed nervousness. The young attorney, barely 3 years out of law school with student debt still weighing heavily on his finances, had taken this case not because he was confident of victory, but because something about Marcus Thompson had convinced him that his client was telling the absolute truth. Now surrounded by the machinery of the legal system and facing an uphill battle against a decorated police officer, he was beginning to question whether truth would be enough. "State of Illinois versus Marcus Thompson," announced the bailiff, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged chamber. The Honorable Patricia Reynolds presiding. Judge Reynolds entered with measured, deliberate steps, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun that matched her stern expression. At 61, she had presided over thousands of cases, and her weathered face told the story of someone who had witnessed every variation of human nature. She settled into her chair behind the imposing bench, her sharp eyes surveying the packed courtroom with the experience of 3 decades on the bench. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice carrying natural authority. "We are here to hear the case of the state of Illinois versus Marcus Thompson. The defendant is charged with driving under the influence, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer." At the prosecution table, Officer Rebecca Sullivan adjusted her uniform with the confidence of someone who had never lost a court case involving her testimony. At 38, she was considered a model officer by her superiors, 14 years on the force, numerous commendations, and a conviction rate that made prosecutors eager to work with her. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight regulation bun, her uniform pressed to military standards, and her pale blue eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to being believed without question. Sullivan's presence dominated her side of the courtroom. At 5 feet 9 inches with an athletic build and the kind of authoritative bearing that came from years of unquestioned power, she embodied everything the public expected from law enforcement. When she spoke, people listened. When she testified, juries believed her. Today, she expected nothing different. But Marcus Thompson carried something Officer Sullivan never expected, a secret that would make her regret every lie she told. "Your Honor," began District Attorney Michael Harrison, a distinguished man in his 50s, whose expensive suit and practiced manner reflected decades of successful prosecutions. "The state will prove that on the evening of April 12th, the defendant drove while intoxicated, violently resisted lawful arrest, and assaulted Officer Sullivan in the performance of her duties." Marcus watched Harrison speak, his expression revealing nothing. But behind those calm eyes, a mind trained in behavioral analysis and tactical assessment was processing every word, every gesture, every subtle tell that revealed the prosecution's strategy. He had faced more dangerous opponents in more hostile environments, but he had never fought a battle where the weapons were words and the battlefield was public perception shaped by institutional bias. What the courtroom didn't know, what no one except Benjamin Foster suspected, was that Marcus Thompson possessed skills and experience that would make this confrontation unlike anything Officer Sullivan had ever encountered. But those capabilities would remain hidden for now, waiting for precisely the right moment to emerge. "Mr. Foster," Judge Reynolds said, turning to the defense table, "are you prepared to proceed?" Benjamin Foster stood slowly, his voice steady despite the anxiety threatening to overwhelm him. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense is ready." Judge Reynolds nodded curtly. "Mr. Harrison, call your first witness." "The state calls Officer Rebecca Sullivan." Officer Sullivan rose from her seat with theatrical precision, every movement calculated to project authority and credibility. Her polished black shoes clicked against the courtroom floor as she made her way to the witness stand, pausing briefly to straighten her already perfect uniform. The gesture was unnecessary, but Sullivan had learned over her 14-year career that juries responded to symbols of order and professionalism. As she settled into the witness chair, Sullivan's eyes swept across the packed courtroom. She nodded slightly toward her fellow officers in the back rows, receiving subtle nods of support in return. This was her domain, her moment to shape the narrative that would determine Marcus Thompson's fate. "Officer Sullivan," D.A. Harrison began, his voice carrying practiced confidence, "please state your name and position for the record." "Rebecca Marie Sullivan, badge number 3892. I've been a patrol officer with the Chicago Police Department for 14 years, currently assigned to the South District." "And on the evening of April 12th, were you on duty?" Sullivan leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice clear and authoritative. "Yes, sir. I was working the evening shift, approximately 9:15 p.m., when I observed a vehicle swerving erratically on Ashland Avenue near 47th Street. In the gallery, several spectators leaned forward. This was the moment they had come to hear, the official version of events that would either condemn or vindicate the man sitting quietly at the defense table. "What did you observe about this vehicle's operation?" Harrison continued. Sullivan's expression grew serious, adopting the look of a professional recounting unpleasant but necessary facts. The vehicle, a silver Honda Accord, was weaving between lanes, crossing the center line multiple times. The driving pattern was consistent with impaired operation. I activated my lights and initiated a traffic stop. From his seat, Marcus watched Sullivan with the kind of focused attention that would have made her uncomfortable if she had understood its true nature. He was reading her, not just her words, but the micro-expressions that flickered across her face, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the witness stand just a fraction too tightly. Everything about her testimony was being processed through analytical filters that Sullivan couldn't even imagine. "Can you describe what happened when the vehicle stopped?" The driver, the defendant, initially refused to roll down his window more than a few inches. When I identified myself and asked him to step out of the vehicle, he became immediately defensive and argumentative. Several jurors exchanged glances. Resistance to police instructions was often seen as a red flag, and Sullivan knew it. "And how did you respond to his refusal to cooperate?" Sullivan straightened in her chair, projecting the image of a patient professional pushed beyond reasonable limits. I explained that I had observed erratic driving and needed him to perform field sobriety tests, but instead of complying, he began questioning my authority and accusing me of racial profiling. The phrase racial profiling hung in the air, loaded with implications that every person in the courtroom understood. Sullivan had strategically introduced it herself, attempting to inoculate her testimony against that obvious line of defense. "At what point did the situation escalate physically?" Harrison inquired. Sullivan paused, as if the memory was particularly difficult to recount. I asked him to step out of the vehicle for the third time, and when I opened his door to assist him, he suddenly lunged at me. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Physical aggression against an officer was serious, potentially deadly serious. "He struck me in the chest with his fist," Sullivan continued, her voice growing more strained. "Then he attempted to grab my service weapon from my holster. At that point I had no choice but to use my baton to defend myself and effect the arrest." The courtroom was completely silent now, the weight of her testimony settling over the proceedings like a suffocating blanket. "And did you fear for your safety, Officer Sullivan?" "Absolutely," Sullivan replied without hesitation. "A suspect attempting to disarm an officer is every cop's worst nightmare. I responded with the minimum force necessary to protect myself and take him into custody." Harrison nodded gravely. "Thank you, Officer Sullivan, your witness, Mr. Foster. When Sullivan claimed Marcus attacked her, she sealed her own fate, because what she didn't know was that Marcus had documented everything." Benjamin Foster stood slowly, his heart pounding as he approached the witness stand. This was the moment that would define not just the case, but potentially his entire legal career. He had spent countless hours preparing for this cross-examination, and while he couldn't reveal his full strategy yet, he was about to plant the first critical seeds of doubt. "Good morning, Officer Sullivan," Foster began, his voice calm and measured. "Good morning," Sullivan replied, her tone cordial but guarded. She had faced cross-examination many times before, and her experience told her to remain composed and stick to her story. "You testified that you've been with the Chicago Police Department for 14 years. In that time, how many arrests have you made that resulted in charges of assault on an officer?" Sullivan's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "I don't keep an exact count, but it happens. Sometimes people don't want to comply with lawful orders. Would you say more than 30 such arrests? More than 50? "Objection," Harrison called out. "Relevance?" "I'll allow it," Judge Reynolds ruled. "Answer the question, Officer Sullivan." "Probably somewhere in that range," Sullivan replied, her voice taking on a slight edge. Foster nodded, making a deliberate note on his legal pad. "And in all these arrests involving assault charges, how often has your body camera malfunctioned?" The question landed like a physical blow. Sullivan's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a micro-expression that didn't escape Marcus's trained observation. "Equipment malfunctions happen," Sullivan said carefully. "Technology isn't perfect. But specifically on the night of April 12th, your body camera failed to record your encounter with my client. Is that correct?" "That's correct." Foster paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Sullivan uncomfortable. "Convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" "Objection," Harrison barked. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Reynolds ruled. "Rephrase, Mr. Foster. Officer Sullivan, in your 14 years of service, approximately how many times has your body camera malfunctioned during an arrest where force was used?" Sullivan shifted in her chair, her composure beginning to show hairline fractures. "I don't track equipment failures specifically, but you would remember if it happened frequently, correct? It doesn't happen frequently. So this malfunction on April 12th was unusual?" "Yes, it was unusual," Sullivan admitted, her voice tight with growing frustration. From her seat at the defense table, Marcus observed the exchange with the analytical precision of someone trained to read human behavior under stress. Sullivan's tells were becoming increasingly apparent, the slight clenching of her jaw, the way her fingers drummed almost imperceptibly against the witness stand, the forced steadiness of her voice that betrayed underlying tension. Foster continued his methodical dismantling. "Officer Sullivan, you testified that my client struck you in the chest. Did this blow cause you to seek medical attention?" "No, it wasn't necessary." "Did you photograph the injury?" "There wasn't visible bruising." "Did you file a separate injury report with your supervisor?" Sullivan hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for several jurors to notice. "It was documented in my arrest report." But no separate injury report was filed. The arrest report was sufficient documentation. Foster nodded, making another deliberate note. "Now, about my client allegedly attempting to grab your weapon. You wear your service weapon on your right side, is that correct?" "Yes." "And you testified that you grabbed my client's arm when you opened his car door." "Which arm?" Sullivan's eyes darted momentarily toward the prosecution table. "His left arm." "So if you were restraining his left arm, how exactly was he able to reach across his body toward your weapon on your right side with his right hand, while also striking you with his fist?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sullivan's face flushed slightly as she processed the logical impossibility she had just described. He was struggling violently. Both arms were involved in the altercation. "But you just testified that you were restraining his left arm." "I was attempting to restrain it, but he was resisting." "And you, a trained officer with 14 years of experience and approximately 40 pounds on my client, were unable to control a man sitting in a vehicle while you were standing with full leverage." "He was stronger than he appeared," Sullivan said, her voice losing some of its earlier authority. Several jurors exchanged skeptical glances. The story was beginning to sound less convincing with each answer. "Officer Sullivan, have you ever been the subject of any complaints regarding excessive use of force?" "Objection!" Harrison shot to his feet. "The officer's personnel record is not relevant to this case." Judge Reynolds considered for a moment. "I'll allow it. Answer the question, Officer Sullivan." Sullivan's face had gone noticeably pale. "There have been a few complaints over the years. They come with the job. People don't like being arrested." "A few," Foster pressed. "Would you say 5 complaints, 10, 15? "I don't recall the exact number. More than 15. Sullivan's silence spoke volumes. The confidence she had displayed at the beginning of her testimony had evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort and evasion. Foster walked slowly back toward the defense table, then turned to face Sullivan once more. "Officer Sullivan, isn't it true that you have a documented pattern of filing exaggerated or false charges against citizens, particularly citizens of color?" "Objection!" Harrison's voice rose with anger. "This is outrageous speculation." "Your Honor," Foster said calmly, "the defense has obtained Officer Sullivan's personnel file through proper legal channels. We can substantiate this pattern." Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her expression stern. "Mr. Foster, do you have documentation to support this line of questioning?" "We do, Your Honor, and we will present it at the appropriate time." The judge nodded slowly. "Proceed, but carefully." The moment Marcus revealed his true background, the entire courtroom understood why he had remained so impossibly calm. The tension in the courtroom had reached a fever pitch as Benjamin Foster concluded his cross-examination of Officer Sullivan. The confident police officer who had taken the stand hours earlier now looked visibly shaken, her carefully constructed testimony showing significant cracks under scrutiny. "No further questions, Your Honor," Foster said, returning to his seat. Judge Reynolds turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Harrison, redirect?" D.A. Harrison stood, attempting to repair the damage to his star witness. "Officer Sullivan, despite Mr. Foster's implications, you were simply doing your job on the night of April 12th, correct?" "Yes, that's correct," Sullivan replied, some of her composure returning. "And the defendant's behavior gave you reasonable cause to believe he was impaired?" "Absolutely. His erratic driving, his defensive attitude, his refusal to comply with lawful orders, all consistent with someone who has been drinking." "Thank you, Officer Sullivan. No further questions." As Sullivan stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes briefly met Marcus's. For the first time since the trial began, she saw something in his expression that sent a chill down her spine. Not anger or fear, but a kind of patient certainty that suggested he knew something she didn't. "The state rests, Your Honor," Harrison announced. Judge Reynolds looked toward the defense table. "Mr. Foster, are you prepared to present your case?" "Yes, Your Honor." The defense calls Marcus Thompson. The silence that fell over the courtroom was different now, heavier, more expectant. Everyone sensed they were about to hear something significant, though none could have imagined just how significant it would prove to be. Marcus rose from the defense table with fluid, controlled movements. He walked to the witness stand without hurry, his bearing reflecting years of discipline and training. When he placed his hand on the Bible and took the oath, his voice was clear, steady, and carried natural authority. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." As he settled into the witness chair, several jurors leaned forward involuntarily. There was something about his presence that commanded attention, not through aggression or drama, but through an unshakable sense of competence and authority. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Foster began. "Please state your full name for the record." "Marcus Jonathan Thompson." "And where do you currently reside?" "Chicago, Illinois. I've lived here for the past 11 months. Foster nodded, his questions designed to establish the basics before moving to more explosive territory. "What is your occupation?" "I recently retired after 23 years of federal service. I'm currently in a transition period, considering my next career move." From the prosecution table, D.A. Harrison frowned. The vague answer suggested there was more to the story, but he couldn't quite identify what it might be. "Mr. Thompson, when you say federal service, can you be more specific?" "Yes, I was a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The courtroom erupted. Judge Reynolds struck her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the revelation had sent shockwaves through every person present. Journalists furiously scribbled notes. Spectators turned to each other in amazement, and the police officers in the back row looked as though they had been struck by lightning. Officer Sullivan's reaction was the most dramatic of all. The blood drained completely from her face, and her hands began to visibly shake. The confident police officer who had taken the stand hours earlier now looked like someone who had just realized she had walked into a trap of her own making. "Order!" Judge Reynolds demanded, her gavel striking the bench with authority. "I will have order in this courtroom or I will clear the gallery." As the noise subsided, Foster continued with renewed intensity. "Mr. Thompson, how long did you serve with the FBI?" 23 years. "And what was your specialty within the Bureau?" Marcus's voice took on a different quality now, still calm, but carrying the weight of experience that few people could claim. "I worked in the Criminal Investigative Division, specializing in public corruption cases. My focus was investigating misconduct by law enforcement officers and other public officials. The implications hit the courtroom like a physical force. Officer Sullivan was no longer just facing a defendant. She was facing someone whose entire career had been built around investigating and prosecuting people exactly like her. "Mr. Thompson, does this specialization involve specific training in detecting deception and analyzing human behavior?" "Extensive training. FBI agents working corruption cases receive advanced instruction in behavioral analysis, interview techniques, statement analysis, and detecting deception indicators. It's essential for the work." Foster paused, allowing the weight of Marcus's credentials to settle over the courtroom. "And on the night of April 12th, when Officer Sullivan pulled you over, were you utilizing any of these professional skills?" "From the moment her lights appeared in my rearview mirror, yes." "Can you tell the court why you were particularly alert that night?" Marcus turned slightly toward the jury, his explanation clear and methodical. "Because Officer Sullivan had pulled me over twice before in the previous 6 months, both times for alleged traffic violations that were questionable at best. Both times her approach was aggressive, and her questions went far beyond what was necessary for a routine traffic stop. I recognized a pattern of targeting." Several jurors' expressions changed from curiosity to concern. The suggestion of racial profiling was no longer speculation. It was coming from someone with professional expertise in recognizing such patterns. Sullivan's confident testimony was about to collide with evidence that would expose not just her lies, but a pattern spanning years. Benjamin Foster moved closer to the witness stand, his confidence growing with each revelation. "Mr. Thompson, you mentioned that Officer Sullivan had pulled you over twice before. Can you describe those encounters?" Marcus's expression remained calm, but there was steel in his voice. "The first time was in October of last year. She claimed I had a broken taillight. When I checked my vehicle immediately after, both taillights were functioning perfectly. The second time was in January. She said I failed to signal a lane change, which was false. I always signal, and my vehicle has a dash cam that proved it." "Did you file complaints about these encounters?" "I did, both times. Neither complaint was investigated thoroughly." From the prosecution table, D.A. Harrison's face had gone pale. He was beginning to understand that his case wasn't just weak. It was about to become a public disaster. "Mr. Thompson, let's talk about the night of April 12th. In your own words, please tell the court what actually happened." Marcus took a slow breath, his gaze moving across the courtroom before settling on the jury. When he spoke, his voice carried quiet authority that made every word feel weighted with truth. "I was driving home from my mother's house in Bronzeville. It was approximately 9:10 p.m. I was traveling south on Ashland Avenue, obeying all traffic laws. At 47th Street, I noticed a patrol car behind me, Officer Sullivan's unit. I recognized her vehicle number from the previous encounters." "What did you do when you noticed her behind you?" "I continued driving normally, but I activated my phone's voice recorder and placed it in my shirt pocket. Given the previous pattern of harassment, I wanted documentation of any interaction." The revelation that Marcus had recorded the encounter sent another wave of reaction through the courtroom. Officer Sullivan's face had gone from pale to ashen. "Why didn't you mention this recording before?" Judge Reynolds interrupted. "Your Honor," Foster responded, "we attempted to notify the prosecution about additional evidence, but our calls were not returned. We're prepared to present this recording now." Harrison started to object, but Judge Reynolds cut him off with a sharp look. "I want to hear this recording. Bailiff, please set up the audio equipment." As the courtroom's sound system was prepared, Marcus continued his testimony. "Officer Sullivan activated her lights approximately 30 seconds after she began following me. I pulled over immediately, turned off my engine, placed my hands on the steering wheel and waited." "And how did Officer Sullivan approach?" "She approached with her hand on her weapon, her flashlight pointed directly at my face, a technique designed to disorient and intimidate. Her first words were, 'Step out of the vehicle right now.' No explanation, no professional courtesy, just an aggressive command." "How did you respond?" "I asked if there was a problem. She ignored my question and repeated her command. I asked what traffic violation I had committed. She said I was swerving, which was completely false. I had not crossed any lines, and I had not been drinking." Foster nodded. "What happened next?" "She opened my door forcefully and grabbed my arm. I remained calm and asked her to explain the legal basis for the stop. That's when she said, 'People like you always think you know your rights.'" The racial implication was clear. Several jurors visibly reacted to this testimony. The pattern Officer Sullivan had followed was becoming undeniably clear. "Mr. Thompson, Officer Sullivan testified that you lunged at her and attempted to grab her weapon. Is that true?" Marcus looked directly at Sullivan, his gaze unwavering. "That is completely false. I never lunged at Officer Sullivan. I never struck her, and I never attempted to reach for her weapon. I remained as still as possible while she forcibly removed me from my vehicle." "Then how do you explain the charges against you?" "Officer Sullivan fabricated every charge. She did it because I questioned her authority, because I knew my rights, and because she has a documented pattern of targeting black professionals who don't submit to intimidation." The certainty in his voice was absolute, leaving no room for doubt or equivocation. Foster walked to the defense table and retrieved his briefcase. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present Exhibit A, the audio recording from Mr. Thompson's phone on the night of April 12th. As Foster connected the recording device to the courtroom speakers, Officer Sullivan whispered urgently to D.A. Harrison, But the prosecutor just shook his head slowly, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop what was about to happen. The recording began to play, and what it revealed would not only vindicate Marcus Thompson, it would expose a pattern of corruption that went far beyond one traffic stop. The smartphone recording would prove everything Marcus said, but it was his next revelation that would destroy Sullivan's career forever. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the audio recording began to play through the speakers. The timestamp showed April 12th, 9:11 p.m., and the audio quality was remarkably clear for a phone recording. The sound of a car engine hummed in the background, then the distinctive chirp of police sirens activating. Marcus's voice came through first, calm and measured. Recording activated. April 12th, 9:11 p.m. Ashland Avenue near 47th Street. Being pulled over by Chicago PD Unit 3892, Officer Sullivan, third time in 6 months. The sound of the car pulling over, engine shutting off. Then footsteps approaching and a flashlight beam, audible through Marcus's reaction. Sullivan's voice cut through, sharp and aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle right now." "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" "I said step out." "Don't make me repeat myself. Can you tell me why you've pulled me over? I wasn't speeding and I haven't committed any traffic violations." "You were swerving all over the road. You been drinking tonight?" The accusation was clear in the recording, but Marcus's response was measured and professional. "No, ma'am, I haven't been drinking. I was driving straight in my lane." "Can you specify which traffic law I violated? Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" "I'm asking you to explain the legal basis for this stop. That's my right as a citizen." The sound of a car door being forcefully opened came through the speakers, followed by the sound of physical contact. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Sullivan's voice had risen in volume and aggression. "My hands are on the steering wheel. I'm not resisting, I'm simply asking. People like you always think you know your rights. Get out of the car now or I'll drag you out." The phrase, "people like you," hung in the courtroom air like an accusation. Several jurors exchanged significant glances, and even Judge Reynolds leaned forward with obvious concern. The recording continued with sounds of physical struggle, not violent but forceful. Marcus's voice remained calm throughout. "Officer Sullivan, you are forcibly removing me from my vehicle without probable cause. I am not resisting. I am recording this encounter. You are violating my civil rights. You're under arrest for DUI and resisting arrest. I'm not intoxicated. And I haven't resisted. You grabbed me first. I'm fully compliant." The sound of handcuffs clicking. Then Sullivan's voice, slightly breathless. "You tried to grab my weapon. That's assault on an officer." "That's false. I never reached for your weapon. I never struck you. You are fabricating charges. We'll see what the judge believes, your word against mine." The recording continued for several more minutes, capturing Sullivan's booking procedures and Marcus's continued calm insistence that he had done nothing wrong and that the charges were fabricated. Throughout the entire encounter, Marcus never raised his voice, never used profanity, and never showed any signs of impairment. When the recording finally ended, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The contrast between Sullivan's sworn testimony and the audio evidence was devastating and undeniable. Judge Reynolds was the first to speak, her voice heavy with barely controlled anger. "Officer Sullivan, having heard this recording, do you wish to modify any part of your earlier testimony?" Sullivan's face had gone completely white. Sweat beaded visibly on her forehead despite the courtroom's air conditioning. She looked desperately toward D.A. Harrison, but the prosecutor had buried his head in his hands, knowing his case had just disintegrated. "Your Honor, the recording, it doesn't capture everything. There might have been moments when—" "Officer Sullivan," Judge Reynolds interrupted sharply, "I'm asking you a direct question. Does this recording accurately represent your interaction with Mr. Thompson?" The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Sullivan finally answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "The recording appears to be accurate, but it doesn't show the full context. Does this recording contradict your earlier testimony about Mr. Thompson lunging at you and attempting to grab your weapon?" Sullivan's hands were shaking visibly now. "Yes, Your Honor." D.A. Harrison stood slowly, his face reflecting the reality of what was happening. "Your Honor, If I could have a moment to consult with my witness. Sit down, Mr. Harrison, Judge Reynolds commanded. Officer Sullivan, are you telling this court that you lied under oath about the events of April 12th? The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on Sullivan, waiting for her response. But before she could answer, Benjamin Foster stood. Your Honor, if I may, the defense has additional evidence that speaks to Officer Sullivan's pattern of misconduct. We have obtained her personnel file through a Freedom of Information Act request, and what it reveals is deeply disturbing. Marcus's FBI training had taught him to spot deception, and Sullivan was displaying every single tell he'd been trained to recognize. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her expression grave. Mr. Foster, you may present your additional evidence. Officer Sullivan, you will remain on the witness stand. Benjamin Foster retrieved a thick manila folder from his briefcase, its contents representing years of complaints, incidents, and warning signs that had been systematically ignored by the department. As he opened it, Officer Sullivan visibly slumped in her chair, as if the weight of her past was physically pressing down on her. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Foster began, his voice carrying new authority, what you're about to hear represents not just one officer's misconduct on a single night, but a pattern of behavior extending over nearly a decade. He began reading from the file, each entry more damaging than the last. March 2016. Complaint filed by Jerome Williams, Iraq War veteran, alleging Officer Sullivan used excessive force during a traffic stop. Mr. Williams claimed Officer Sullivan struck him with her baton, despite his full compliance. Complaint investigated, but dismissed without disciplinary action. The connection to military veterans sent a murmur through the courtroom, particularly among the spectators who themselves had served. November 2016. Complaint filed by Dr. Keisha Martinez, emergency room physician, alleging Officer Sullivan made racially inappropriate comments during a routine traffic stop and threatened arrest when Dr. Martinez asked for her badge number. Complaint filed, but no disciplinary action taken. Foster's voice grew stronger with each entry, the pattern becoming undeniably clear. June 2017. Complaint filed by attorney David Foster, no relation to me, alleging Officer Sullivan falsified details in an arrest report. Mr. Foster had video evidence contradicting Sullivan's official statement. Case was settled quietly, complaint sealed. Judge Reynolds' expression darkened with each revelation. This wasn't just about one bad traffic stop, it was about systemic failure to hold an officer accountable. February 2018, complaint filed by Pastor Michael Robinson, alleging Officer Sullivan planted drug paraphernalia during a vehicle search. Internal Affairs investigation opened but mysteriously closed without resolution 6 months later. September 2019. Complaint filed by Professor Angela Harris, alleging Officer Sullivan used false testimony in court proceedings involving a student protest. The professor provided witness statements contradicting Sullivan's version of events. Complaint filed, but case sealed by departmental review. January 2020. Complaint filed by Marcus Thompson, first incident, alleging pretextual traffic stop without probable cause. Complaint dismissed without investigation. July 2020. Complaint filed by Carlos Mendez, small business owner, alleging Officer Sullivan demanded payment to avoid citations. Mr. Mendez had recorded the interaction. Investigation opened, then closed citing insufficient evidence despite the recording. January 2021. Complaint filed by Marcus Thompson, second incident, alleging harassment and false citation. Complaint dismissed. Foster closed the folder slowly, allowing the weight of the evidence to settle over the courtroom. Your Honor, what we see here is not just Officer Sullivan's pattern of misconduct, but a pattern of a department that consistently failed to hold her accountable. Every complaint, every warning sign, every victim who came forward was ignored, dismissed, or covered up. Judge Reynolds' face had hardened into an expression of controlled fury. Mr. Foster, are you suggesting that Officer Sullivan's superiors were aware of these complaints and took no action? I am, Your Honor. And I'm suggesting that their failure to act directly enabled what happened to Mr. Thompson on April 12th. From the witness stand, Officer Sullivan finally spoke, her voice cracking. Your Honor, I want to recant my testimony. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Even Judge Reynolds looked momentarily surprised by the sudden confession. Order, the judge commanded, striking her gavel repeatedly. Order in this courtroom. As silence gradually returned, Sullivan remained in her seat, tears now streaming down her face. The confident officer who had taken the stand hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone whose carefully constructed lies had finally caught up with her. Officer Sullivan, Judge Reynolds said sternly, are you saying you wish to change your testimony? Sullivan nodded, her hands trembling. Yes, Your Honor. The recording, Mr. Thompson's testimony, the evidence, it's all true. I lied about what happened that night. D.A. Harrison sat in stunned silence, his career flashing before his eyes as he watched his star witness confess to perjury in open court. I fabricated the charges, Sullivan continued, her voice barely audible through her tears. Mr. Thompson never lunged at me. He never tried to grab my weapon. He never struck me. He was calm and professional the entire time, and I arrested him anyway because he questioned me, because he knew his rights, because I was angry that someone wouldn't just comply without asking questions. The admission sent shockwaves through every person present. This wasn't just a correction of testimony. It was a complete confession of corruption and abuse of power. Marcus sat at the defense table, his expression unchanged. He had known from the beginning that the truth would emerge. His FBI training had taught him that lies always unravel when confronted with systematic evidence and patient analysis. Why are you admitting this now? Judge Reynolds asked. Sullivan looked at Marcus, then back at the judge. Because he's right about everything. The recording proves it. The pattern in my file proves it. And continuing to lie would only make it worse. I violated my oath. I violated the law. I violated the trust of every person I was supposed to serve. Foster seized the moment. Your Honor, in light of Officer Sullivan's admission, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges against Marcus Thompson. So moved, Judge Reynolds said without hesitation. All charges against Marcus Thompson are hereby dismissed with prejudice. She turned to Sullivan. Officer Sullivan, I am holding you in contempt of court for perjury. You will remain in custody pending formal charges. Bailiff, take Officer Sullivan into custody. As handcuffs clicked around Sullivan's wrists, the same handcuffs she had used on countless others, the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. A police officer was being arrested for lying about charges she had fabricated against an innocent man. But Judge Reynolds wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate federal investigation into the Chicago Police Department's handling of complaints against Officer Sullivan. The pattern of ignored misconduct presented in this courtroom suggests systemic failures that demand federal oversight. She turned to D.A. Harrison. Mr. Harrison, your office will cooperate fully with this investigation. If I find evidence that prosecutors were aware of Officer Sullivan's pattern and continued to rely on her testimony, there will be additional consequences. Harrison nodded weakly, knowing his career was likely over regardless of what the investigation found. Marcus stood as Judge Reynolds addressed him directly. Mr. Thompson, this court owes you an apology. You have been subjected to false arrest, character assassination, fabricated criminal charges, and a legal system that initially failed to recognize the truth. Your professional background and your dignified response throughout this ordeal reflect the highest standards of American citizenship and law enforcement integrity. She paused, her voice carrying the weight of formal declaration. Furthermore, I am recommending that you pursue civil action against Officer Sullivan and the Chicago Police Department for civil rights violations, malicious prosecution, and the systematic pattern of misconduct that enabled this injustice. Marcus nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. Justice has many forms, and I will pursue all appropriate legal remedies to ensure this doesn't happen to others. When the personnel file was opened, it revealed a truth more disturbing than anyone imagined. As the formal proceedings concluded, and Officer Sullivan was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom began to empty, but journalists immediately swarmed the hallway, eager for statements. Marcus handled each question with the same calm professionalism he had displayed throughout the trial. Mr. Thompson, called out a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. As a former FBI agent who investigated police corruption, what do you want people to understand about this case? Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. This case isn't just about me or Officer Sullivan. It's about accountability. When law enforcement officers abuse their power, the entire justice system suffers. But when the truth comes to light and accountability is enforced, it reminds us that our institutions can work when we demand they work properly. Will you be filing a civil lawsuit? Justice takes many forms, Marcus replied. Legal remedies are one part of ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. But systemic reform is equally important. The complaints against Officer Sullivan were ignored for nearly a decade. That pattern of institutional failure must be addressed. Another reporter pressed forward. Your FBI background clearly helped you document this encounter and present evidence effectively. What advice would you give to ordinary citizens who don't have that training? Know your rights, document everything you can safely document, and never accept that abuse of power is inevitable. File formal complaints, seek legal counsel, demand accountability. Change doesn't happen when people accept injustice as normal. Benjamin Foster joined Marcus in the hallway, his face beaming with satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. I have to ask, when did you know we were going to win this case? Marcus smiled. The first genuinely warm expression anyone had seen from him throughout the entire ordeal. From the moment Officer Sullivan took the stand and started fabricating her testimony, my training taught me that lies always collapse under systematic scrutiny, especially when the person lying doesn't know they're being analyzed by someone who spent 23 years doing exactly that. The recording was brilliant. When did you start recording your interactions with police? After the first pretextual stop, I recognized a pattern immediately: the aggressive approach, the vague justifications, the way she targeted me specifically. As an FBI agent who investigated police corruption, I knew exactly what was happening and how to document it properly. Foster shook his head in amazement. Sullivan had no idea who she was targeting. That's the problem with officers who abuse their power, Marcus said quietly. They become so accustomed to people being intimidated by the badge that they forget not everyone is powerless. And they definitely don't expect to encounter someone who spent their entire career bringing down corrupt officials. Inside the courtroom, Judge Reynolds was meeting privately with representatives from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The federal investigation she had ordered was already beginning, with agents pulling years of records and preparing to interview dozens of complainants whose voices had been silenced. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Martinez was leading the investigation. Your Honor, based on the evidence presented today, we're expanding our investigation beyond Officer Sullivan. The pattern of dismissed complaints and sealed cases suggests potential obstruction at the supervisory level. That's exactly what concerns me, Judge Reynolds replied. This wasn't just one officer going rogue. This was institutional failure to hold her accountable, despite overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Meanwhile, at Chicago Police Department headquarters, Chief Linda Marshall was facing her own reckoning. The revelations from the trial had triggered emergency meetings with the mayor's office, and calls for her resignation were already flooding social media. Marshall sat in her office, reviewing the same personnel file that had been presented in court. Every complaint was documented, every warning sign was there, yet nothing had been done. Her predecessors had failed to act, and she had inherited a ticking time bomb that had finally exploded in the most public way possible. Her phone rang. It was Mayor Johnson, and the conversation was brief and pointed. Chief Marshall, I've just watched the news coverage of the Thompson trial. We need immediate action. I want a plan for comprehensive reform on my desk within 48 hours, and I want you to personally reach out to Mr. Thompson regarding his potential role in implementing those reforms. Yes, sir, I understand. This is a disaster, Linda, but it's also an opportunity. If we handle this right, we can transform this department. If we mishandle it, we'll face federal oversight for a generation. Marshall hung up and immediately called an emergency meeting of her command staff. When they assembled in the conference room an hour later, their faces reflected a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and concern. Gentlemen and ladies, Marshall began. "What happened in that courtroom today is unacceptable. Officer Sullivan's misconduct is appalling, but our failure to address it earlier is equally inexcusable. We are implementing immediate reforms, starting today." She pulled up a presentation on the screen. First, every body camera will now upload footage automatically to secure cloud servers with independent oversight. No more malfunctions that conveniently occur during controversial encounters. Second, all complaints against officers will be investigated by an independent civilian review board with subpoena power. No more internal investigations that go nowhere. Third, we are implementing mandatory de-escalation training, implicit bias recognition, and community engagement programs. And we're bringing in outside experts, including, if he's willing, Marcus Thompson, to help design and implement these reforms. Deputy Chief Anderson spoke up. "Chief, some of the officers aren't going to like this. They'll see it as capitulation." "I don't care if they like it," Marshall responded sharply. "The officers who are doing their jobs properly have nothing to fear from accountability and transparency. And the officers who are uncomfortable with oversight should find another profession." She pulled up the final slide. "We have a choice. We can resist reform and face federal oversight, or we can embrace change and rebuild community trust. I'm choosing reform. Anyone who can't support that can submit their resignation." Back at his modest apartment in Hyde Park, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the day's events. His phone had been ringing constantly with media requests, job offers, and messages of support from around the country. But it was a text message from his mother that brought a rare smile to his face. "I'm proud of you, son. Not just for winning, but for how you won. With dignity and truth, that's what matters." Marcus typed a response. "Thanks, Mom. Dad would have been proud too. This is what he taught me, that justice is worth fighting for, even when the system makes it hard." His father, a Chicago police officer for 30 years who had died 5 years earlier, had been the reason Marcus joined law enforcement. The elder Thompson had been a model of integrity and professionalism, the kind of officer who built trust between police and community through respect and fairness. Officer Sullivan's behavior would have devastated him, Marcus thought, but the accountability and reform that followed might have given him hope. Sullivan's breakdown on the stand shocked everyone. But what came next would change the entire department. 3 days after the trial that captivated Chicago, Officer Rebecca Sullivan sat in a federal holding facility, awaiting formal arraignment on charges of perjury, civil rights violations, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Her attorney, provided by the police union, had already begun negotiating a plea agreement. Knowing that fighting the charges would be futile given her courtroom confession. But Sullivan's legal troubles were just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The Department of Justice's investigation, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Martinez, had moved with unprecedented speed. Within 72 hours, federal agents had interviewed 43 individuals who had filed complaints against Sullivan over the years, and the pattern that emerged was even more disturbing than the courtroom revelations had suggested. Martinez sat in her office, reviewing the mounting evidence with her team. "What we're seeing isn't just one corrupt officer," she told her investigators. "We're seeing systematic suppression of complaints, retaliation against witnesses, and potential criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice." Agent Robert Chen, a veteran FBI investigator, nodded grimly. "We've identified at least 6 supervisors who received complaints about Sullivan and either dismissed them without investigation or actively buried evidence. Some of these complaints included video evidence that mysteriously disappeared from evidence rooms. That's obstruction," Martinez said flatly. "Start preparing criminal referrals for anyone involved in suppressing evidence or retaliating against complainants." The investigation had also uncovered something that hadn't been revealed in the trial. Officer Sullivan had been part of an informal network of officers who shared tactics for avoiding accountability. Text messages recovered from her phone showed conversations about disabling body cameras, coordinating false testimony, and intimidating complainants into dropping complaints. Back at the Chicago Police Department, Chief Linda Marshall was implementing the reforms she had promised. But resistance was stronger than she had anticipated. A group of veteran officers, led by their union representative, had filed a formal grievance claiming the new oversight measures violated their labor contract. Marshall stood firm. At a tense meeting with union leadership, she laid out her position with clarity. "The contract protects good officers doing their jobs properly," she said. "It doesn't protect officers who abuse their authority, fabricate charges, or lie under oath. If you want to fight for those officers, you're fighting for the wrong thing." Union President Tom Bradley leaned forward. "Chief, our members are concerned that these reforms assume guilt rather than innocence. They feel like they're being treated as suspects. Good officers have nothing to fear from body cameras that actually work and complaints that are actually investigated," Marshall countered. "What they should fear is being associated with officers like Rebecca Sullivan, who betrayed everything the badge represents." She pulled up data on the screen. "Do you know what I learned this week? In the past decade, we've had over 200 complaints alleging serious misconduct. Of those, only 12 resulted in any disciplinary action. That's a 6% accountability rate. Does that sound like a system that's working?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "Sometimes complaints are unfounded, and sometimes they're legitimate, but buried because we prioritize protecting our own over protecting the public we serve. That ends now." Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson had been contacted by numerous organizations seeking his expertise. Police departments across the country wanted him to consult on reform efforts. Civil rights organizations wanted him to speak about police accountability. Law schools wanted him to teach courses on civil rights enforcement, but the most interesting offer came from an unexpected source, Chief Marshall herself. They met at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop in Lincoln Park. Marshall arrived in civilian clothes, her expression reflecting both the weight of her position and genuine humility. "Mr. Thompson, I want to start by apologizing," she began. "Not just for what Officer Sullivan did to you, but for the systemic failures that allowed her to operate with impunity for so long. I inherited this mess, but that doesn't excuse the fact that it happened on my watch." Marcus listened carefully, his FBI training making him assess whether this was genuine contrition or damage control. "I've read your file," Marshall continued. 23 years with the FBI, stellar record investigating public corruption, multiple commendations for integrity and professionalism. You're exactly the kind of law enforcement officer we should aspire to be. What do you want from me, Chief? "I want you to help us fix this department. I'm creating a new position, Director of Accountability and Professional Standards. It would report directly to me and have authority to investigate complaints, recommend discipline, and implement training reforms. I want you to consider taking that role." Marcus was surprised. "You want someone you just prosecuted to come work for you?" "I want someone who has the credibility to make real change. Someone the community will trust and officers will respect because of your background. Someone who can't be intimidated or corrupted because you've already faced worse than anything this department could throw at you. That's assuming officers would respect rather than resent me. The good officers will respect you. The problematic ones will resent you, which is exactly how I'll know the system is working." Marcus considered the offer. "I'd need complete independence, no interference, no political pressure, no cases being buried for optics. You'd have it in writing, contractually guaranteed. I'd need to handpick my team and have authority to fire officers who commit serious misconduct, subject to civil service procedures. Done. And I'd need access to all personnel files, complaint records, and body camera footage without restriction. You'd have complete access." Marcus studied Marshall's face, analyzing her sincerity. After 23 years reading people, he believed she was genuine, or at least desperate enough to be committed to real reform. "I'll think about it," he said finally, "but I have conditions beyond what I've already mentioned. The investigation would uncover corruption so deep that it reached the highest levels of command." 2 weeks after his meeting with Chief Marshall, Marcus Thompson stood before the City Council's Public Safety Committee, testifying about his conditions for accepting the position of Director of Accountability and Professional Standards. Alderman Patricia Williams, chair of the committee, led the questioning. "Mr. Thompson, you've outlined extensive conditions for taking this position. Some might say you're asking for too much authority. Marcus's response was measured but firm. Alderman Williams, half measures won't fix a system that has been broken for decades. Either you want genuine reform, which requires genuine power to implement it, or you want the appearance of reform, which accomplishes nothing except protecting the status quo. Can you elaborate on your key conditions? First, complete independence from political interference. My office answers to the law and to the community, not to political pressure or public relations concerns. Second, subpoena power to compel testimony and evidence from any member of the department, regardless of rank. Third, authority to recommend termination for officers who commit serious misconduct, with those recommendations subject to binding arbitration by neutral third parties, not internal review boards. Some officers are concerned this creates a hostile work environment. Marcus leaned forward. With respect, Alderman, a hostile work environment is when good officers have to work alongside corrupt ones and face retaliation for speaking up. What I'm proposing creates accountability, which good officers welcome because it protects them from being associated with the misconduct of bad officers. Alderman James Rodriguez spoke up. Mr. Thompson, you've also requested involvement from community organizations in the oversight process. Can you explain that? The communities most affected by police misconduct should have a voice in accountability measures. I'm proposing a community advisory board with real input into policy development, complaint review, and officer evaluation. Not token representation, but genuine partnership. What about concerns regarding confidentiality of personnel matters? Personnel matters that involve potential civil rights violations or criminal conduct are matters of public concern, not private employment issues. Transparency is essential for rebuilding trust. The committee deliberated for an hour before voting unanimously to approve Marcus's conditions and authorize his appointment. The decision was historic. No civilian had ever been given such comprehensive authority over police operations in Chicago's history. Meanwhile, the federal investigation had expanded dramatically. DOJ attorneys had now identified 12 current or former supervisors who had actively suppressed complaints against Officer Sullivan and other problematic officers. 4 of them were facing criminal charges for obstruction of justice. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez held a press conference to announce the indictments. These supervisors didn't just fail to investigate complaints, they actively buried evidence, intimidated witnesses, and retaliated against officers who tried to report misconduct. They created a culture where abuse of power was protected rather than punished. The indictments sent shockwaves through the department. Officers who had remained silent for years began coming forward with their own stories of retaliation and cover-ups. The blue wall of silence was cracking. One of those officers was Detective Sarah Brooks, a 15-year veteran who had tried to report Sullivan's misconduct 3 years earlier and had been transferred to a less desirable assignment as punishment. Brooks met privately with Marcus in his new office, her voice shaking as she described what she had witnessed. I saw Sullivan plant evidence during a search. I reported it to my sergeant, who told me to keep quiet if I valued my career. When I persisted, I was suddenly transferred to the night shift in the most dangerous district. Are you willing to testify about this? Marcus asked. Now that there's real accountability? Yes, but I wasn't willing to sacrifice my career when I knew nothing would come of it. That's exactly the culture we're changing, Marcus assured her. Officers who report misconduct will be protected, not punished, and supervisors who retaliate will face consequences. Over the next month, Marcus assembled his team. He recruited former FBI agents, civil rights attorneys, and community organizers. He established clear protocols for investigating complaints, transparent criteria for evaluating officer conduct, and protection mechanisms for whistleblowers. But the real test came when he received his first major complaint, allegations that a group of officers in the South District were systematically conducting illegal searches and sharing the proceeds from seized cash. Marcus deployed his team immediately. Within 2 weeks, they had gathered video evidence, witness testimony, and financial records documenting the scheme. 8 officers were suspended, and criminal charges were being prepared. The police union erupted in protest, claiming Marcus was conducting a witch hunt. Union President Bradley called for his removal, arguing that he was destroying officer morale. Marcus held a press conference to respond. Morale suffers when good officers have to work alongside corrupt ones. Morale suffers when the public doesn't trust law enforcement because accountability is absent. What damages morale is a culture that protects misconduct instead of punishing it. He pulled up statistics on the screen. In the 6 weeks since our office opened, we've received 78 complaints. Of those, 43 were determined to be unfounded after thorough investigation. 20 were resolved through mediation and additional training. 15 are under active investigation for serious misconduct. That's what real accountability looks like, taking every complaint seriously, investigating thoroughly, and taking action when evidence supports it. The data showed something remarkable. As accountability increased, certain types of complaints actually decreased. Use of force incidents had dropped by 30%. Complaints about officer attitude and professionalism had declined by 25%. Officers who knew they would be held accountable were behaving more professionally. Chief Marshal stood beside Marcus at the press conference. These results prove what we've been saying. Accountability makes everyone safer. It protects the community from abuse of power. And it protects good officers from false accusations because we investigate thoroughly and make decisions based on evidence. But not everyone was convinced. A group of veteran officers facing investigation for their roles in covering up Sullivan's misconduct filed a lawsuit claiming Marcus's authority was unconstitutional. The case would test whether real reform could survive legal challenges from those invested in maintaining the old system. Marcus Thompson didn't just win his case, he sparked a revolution in police accountability. 6 months after Marcus Thompson's appointment, the transformation of the Chicago Police Department was undeniable. The statistics told a powerful story. Complaints of excessive force had dropped by 40%, body camera violations had been reduced to near zero, and community trust scores had improved for the first time in a decade. But the changes went deeper than numbers. The culture itself was shifting. Officer James Martinez, a 5-year veteran, described the difference to a local news reporter. Before, if you spoke up about another officer's misconduct, you were treated like a traitor. Now staying silent makes you complicit. That's a fundamental change in how we think about our responsibilities. The civilian review board that Marcus had established was functioning exactly as designed. Community representatives worked alongside trained investigators to review complaints, and their recommendations carried real weight. When the board recommended termination for officers who committed serious misconduct, those recommendations were upheld. One of the most significant cases involved Sergeant Kevin Bradley, who had supervised Officer Sullivan and dismissed multiple complaints against her. The review board found that Bradley had not only ignored the complaints, but had actively intimidated witnesses and destroyed evidence. Marcus personally presented the findings to Chief Marshal. Sergeant Bradley's conduct wasn't just poor supervision, it was criminal obstruction. He created the environment that allowed Sullivan to operate with impunity. Marshal reviewed the evidence with a grim expression. Recommendation: termination and criminal referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Done. Anything else? Yes. Bradley wasn't acting alone. We've identified a network of mid-level supervisors who operated similarly. They called themselves the Brotherhood and had an explicit code of protecting their own, regardless of misconduct. How many? At least 15, maybe more. Marshal closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the magnitude of the corruption that had taken root in her department. Give me the full report. We'll address every single one. Meanwhile, Officer Rebecca Sullivan's case had concluded with a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to perjury, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. Her sentence: 3 years in federal prison, permanent prohibition from law enforcement, and restitution to Marcus Thompson and other victims. At her sentencing hearing, Sullivan addressed the court with what appeared to be genuine remorse. I violated everything I swore to uphold. I targeted people because of their race. I fabricated charges because of my ego, and I lied to protect myself. Mr. Thompson deserved better. Every person I encountered as an officer deserved better. Judge Reynolds, who had presided over both the original trial and the sentencing, offered stern words. "Officer Sullivan, you didn't just betray your oath. You betrayed every honest officer trying to build trust with their community. Your actions made their jobs harder and more dangerous. That's why accountability matters." But Sullivan's imprisonment was just one outcome. The civil lawsuit that Marcus filed against Sullivan and the Chicago Police Department had been settled for $8 million. Marcus donated the majority of the settlement to organizations supporting police reform and legal assistance for individuals facing wrongful charges. The gesture reinforced what had become clear throughout the process. This was never about personal vindication or financial gain. It was about systemic change. Marcus used a portion of the settlement to establish the Thompson Foundation for Police Accountability, which provided legal support to individuals facing false charges and funded research on effective accountability measures. Within 6 months, the foundation was supporting cases in 14 cities and had become a national model for civilian-led police reform. The resistance to reform continued, but was increasingly marginalized. The lawsuit filed by officers opposing Marcus's authority had been dismissed by a federal judge who ruled that civilian oversight of police was not only constitutional, but essential for maintaining community trust and protecting civil rights. Judge Catherine Morrison's opinion was scathing toward the plaintiffs. The officers challenging these accountability measures asked this court to protect them from oversight. But oversight is not oppression, it is the foundation of professional public service. Officers who cannot accept accountability should find different employment. The decision was appealed, but legal experts predicted it would be upheld. The momentum toward accountability was too strong to reverse. Marcus's work attracted national attention. He was invited to testify before Congress on police reform legislation, and his recommendations were incorporated into proposed federal standards for law enforcement accountability. Departments across the country were adopting Chicago's model, creating independent oversight offices with real authority to investigate and discipline. But perhaps the most significant change was the one happening quietly, day by day, in the interactions between officers and the community. Officers who knew they would be held accountable for misconduct were treating people with more respect. Community members who saw accountability in action were more willing to trust that their complaints would be taken seriously. Detective Sarah Brooks, the officer who had been retaliated against for reporting misconduct, described the transformation. "I can finally do my job the way I was trained to do it, with integrity. I don't have to worry about being punished for doing the right thing." That's what real reform looks like. The federal investigation that began with Officer Sullivan's perjury had now resulted in criminal charges against 19 current or former Chicago police officials. Trials were scheduled throughout the following year, and plea agreements were being negotiated for several defendants who agreed to cooperate with ongoing investigations. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez summarized the investigation's impact. What started as one case of false arrest revealed a culture of corruption that reached the highest levels of command. But it also revealed that change is possible when institutions are forced to confront their failures, and when individuals like Marcus Thompson refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The reforms weren't just policy changes, they were a complete transformation of how justice would be served. 1 year after the trial that transformed Chicago's police department, Marcus Thompson stood in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by other recipients of the Presidential Citizens Medal. The award given to Americans who have performed exemplary service for their country recognized not just his FBI career, but his role in advancing justice and accountability in civilian law enforcement. President Anderson's citation read, "For his unwavering commitment to truth, his courageous response to injustice, and his dedication to reforming the systems that serve all Americans, Marcus Thompson exemplifies the finest traditions of law enforcement and civic leadership." The ceremony was attended by law enforcement leaders, civil rights organizations, and community advocates. A coalition that might have seemed unlikely before Marcus's case brought together groups that shared common ground in their commitment to accountability and justice. Chief Linda Marshall, whose department had undergone dramatic transformation, spoke during the ceremony. Marcus Thompson didn't just seek justice for himself. He forced all of us to confront difficult truths about our institutions and our responsibilities. The Chicago Police Department is stronger today because of his courage and his expertise. The reforms implemented in Chicago had become a blueprint for departments nationwide. The independent oversight model, the civilian review board with real authority, the automatic body camera uploads, the protection for whistleblowers, all were being adopted across the country. The statistics from Chicago were compelling. In the year since the reforms were implemented, use of force incidents had declined by 53%. Complaints of officer misconduct had dropped by 48%. Simultaneously, officer morale among those committed to professional policing had increased, as good officers no longer feared being associated with the misconduct of their corrupt colleagues. Crime rates had also declined, contrary to predictions from reform opponents who claimed accountability would lead to officers being afraid to do their jobs. The data proved what advocates had argued all along. Professional, accountable policing is more effective than heavy-handed tactics that erode community trust. Officer Rebecca Sullivan, serving her federal prison sentence, had become an unlikely voice for reform. In an interview from prison, she spoke with apparent genuine remorse about her actions and their consequences. "I convinced myself that aggressive tactics and protecting other officers were part of being a good cop," Sullivan said. "But real police work requires trust, and you can't have trust without accountability. I destroyed trust, and I destroyed lives. If my case helps create systems that prevent other officers from making my mistakes, maybe something good can come from the terrible things I did." The Thompson Foundation for Police Accountability had grown into a national organization with offices in 12 cities. It provided legal representation to individuals facing false charges, funded research on effective accountability measures, and trained community advocates on how to navigate complaint processes. Perhaps most significantly, the foundation had helped over 200 individuals overturn wrongful convictions or resolve false charges. Many of those cases involving officers who, like Sullivan, had patterns of fabricating evidence that had been ignored by their departments. Marcus had also accepted a teaching position at Northwestern University School of Law, where he taught a course on civil rights enforcement and police accountability. His classes were among the most sought after in the law school, with students eager to learn from someone who had both investigated corruption as an FBI agent and experienced it as a target of police misconduct. During one particularly memorable class session, a student asked Marcus what he thought was the most important lesson from his case. "The most important lesson," Marcus replied thoughtfully, "is that accountability isn't the enemy of effective law enforcement. It's the foundation of it. Good officers want accountability because it protects their professionalism and distinguishes them from corrupt ones. Community members need accountability because it provides a pathway to justice when things go wrong. And institutions benefit from accountability because it prevents the kind of systemic corruption that erodes public trust." The student pressed further. "But you had advantages most people don't have: FBI training, knowledge of the legal system, resources to fight back. What about ordinary citizens who face similar situations?" "That's exactly why systemic reform matters," Marcus answered. "Not everyone has my background or my resources. That's why we need independent oversight that works for everyone, body cameras that can't be disabled, complaint processes that are transparent and effective, and consequences for officers who abuse their power. Justice shouldn't depend on whether the victim happens to be a former FBI agent." Back in Chicago, the reforms Marcus had championed continued to evolve and improve. The Civilian Review Board had expanded to include representatives from all of Chicago's diverse communities. The training programs now incorporated input from mental health professionals, community organizers, and citizens who had experienced both positive and negative police encounters. Chief Marshall had become a national advocate for police reform, speaking at conferences and consulting with other departments. "Marcus Thompson changed my department and changed my understanding of what accountability means," she told audiences. "Real accountability isn't about punishing officers. It's about creating systems that reward professionalism and address misconduct before it becomes a pattern." The legal precedent set by Judge Reynolds's rulings in the case had influenced decisions in dozens of other jurisdictions. Courts were increasingly recognizing that civilian oversight of police was not only constitutional, but essential for maintaining the balance between law enforcement authority and civil rights protections. The federal investigation that began with Sullivan's perjury had concluded with convictions or plea agreements for all 19 defendants. Several former supervisors were serving prison sentences for obstruction of justice and civil rights violations. The message was clear: covering up police misconduct was no longer tolerated. As Marcus stood in the White House, accepting his medal and reflecting on the journey from that night on Ashland Avenue to this moment of national recognition, he thought about his father. The elder Thompson had spent 30 years as a Chicago police officer, building trust through integrity and professionalism. "This is for you, Dad," Marcus thought, "for showing me that law enforcement at its best is about service, not power, about protecting rights, not violating them, about accountability to the community, not protection of bad actors who betray the badge." The ceremony concluded with remarks from President Anderson, who spoke directly about the importance of Marcus's example. In a time when trust between law enforcement and communities has been strained, Marcus Thompson reminds us that accountability and integrity are not partisan issues, they are American values. His courage in standing up for truth, and his commitment to ensuring that others don't face the same injustice, reflect the best of what public service can be. After the ceremony, Marcus was approached by dozens of people with their own stories of police misconduct. Some were victims seeking advice. Others were officers who wanted to implement similar reforms in their own departments. Each conversation reinforced why the work mattered. One conversation stood out. A young black woman named Tamika Williams approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Thompson, my brother was arrested 2 years ago on false charges by an officer with a pattern of misconduct. We couldn't prove it at the time, and he served 18 months in prison. But because of your case and the reforms it created, we were able to reopen his case. Last week his conviction was overturned. Thank you for fighting not just for yourself, but for all of us." Marcus embraced her, his own eyes misting. "That's why accountability matters. Your brother deserved justice, and I'm glad the system finally provided it." Later that evening, at a reception in his honor, Marcus was asked by a journalist what he hoped his legacy would be. "I don't think of it as my legacy," Marcus replied. "This was never about me personally. It was about creating systems that work for everyone. Systems where truth matters, where evidence is valued over institutional loyalty, where victims of injustice have real pathways to accountability." He paused, looking around the room at the diverse coalition of people who had come together around these principles. "If there's any legacy I hope for, it's that a generation from now, what we're doing today will seem obvious and necessary. That police accountability, civilian oversight, and protection for those who speak truth to power will be so embedded in our institutions that people will wonder why it was ever controversial." Back in Chicago, life had returned to a new normal, one fundamentally different from before. Marcus split his time between his oversight role, his teaching, and his foundation work. The days were long, the challenges were constant, but the impact was undeniable. On a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 2 years after the traffic stop that changed everything, Marcus drove down Ashland Avenue past 47th Street, the exact spot where Officer Sullivan had pulled him over. He pulled to the side of the road and sat for a moment, remembering that night. He remembered the fear he had felt, despite all his training and experience. He remembered the anger at being targeted for no reason other than his skin color. He remembered the determination to document everything and fight back through the system. But most of all, he remembered the decision he had made in that moment, not to respond with violence or anger, but to trust in truth and accountability. That decision had been vindicated in ways he never could have imagined. His phone buzzed with a text from Benjamin Foster, his attorney who had become a close friend. "Just got word. 3 more departments are implementing the Chicago model. Your work is spreading." Marcus smiled and typed back, "Not my work, our work. Change happens when good people refuse to accept injustice as normal." He pulled back onto Ashland Avenue and drove home. Past neighborhoods where police-community relations were slowly healing, past the courthouse where truth had prevailed over lies, past the headquarters where accountability had replaced cover-ups. The work wasn't finished. It would never be truly finished. There would always be those who abused power, always be systems that needed reform, always be fights for justice that required courage and persistence. But Marcus Thompson had proven something essential, that one person's refusal to accept injustice, combined with expertise, documentation, and unwavering commitment to truth, could transform entire systems. That accountability was possible even against powerful institutions. That reform could work when it was genuine, comprehensive, and enforced. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus thought about the hundreds of people whose lives had been changed by the reforms he had helped implement, the individuals whose false charges had been overturned, the officers who could now do their jobs with integrity without fear of retaliation, the communities that were beginning to trust that their complaints would be heard and addressed. This was the real victory, not winning his own case, but creating a system where victories like his were possible for everyone. Thank you to everyone who typed truth and shared your locations with us. Seeing this global community united for accountability and justice proves that integrity is a universal human value. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more stories of truth, triumphing over corruption, and brave individuals standing against systemic injustice. Until next time, remember that one person's courage to expose the truth can transform an entire system.